to call to order the meeting of February 9th of the Larkspur Planning Commission. Can we have a roll call?
Okay, roll call. I'll start from my.
Hey, sorry guys, I thought I was a little later.
There he is.
I just got home.
You're here. Are you going to start the roll call?
Okay, I'm starting the roll call now, and from my top to bottom, I'll start with Commissioner Kunstler.
Present.
Chairman Wagstaff.
I'm here.
Commissioner Chalmers.
Yeah.
And Commissioner Swisher.
I am here.
Okay. And for some reason on my screen, it has Commissioner Swisher and Chalmers also identified as Daniel Kunstler.
Yeah, it's because
I think because we all came in on his.
Oh, you came in through his email. Okay.
Yeah, I forwarded the
yeah.
email.
Yeah, I noticed that.
You can change that easily enough if it's an embarrassment.
Oh no, we're all proud to be you, Dan.
We should probably ask if there are any people in the audience with matters that are not on the agenda out there somewhere that would like to speak.
Nobody?
So
Aaron?
Sorry, I was just fixing the names. There are no hands raised.
Okay. Yeah, and for the record, Commissioner Tauber was not feeling well and could not attend tonight. So with that, on the planning director's report, there's really, I could go into a whole smorgasbord of challenges and things we're dealing with, but more or less, we're just conducting business as usual. In times of COVID, there is a lot of interest in discussing potential housing projects. So we have some of that going on. I'll talk a little bit about that more as we get into the business item. But with that, I don't have anything more to report.
okay. Let's move on to the business items and the annual progress report.
Okay, the annual progress report is a process, is a requirement of state law for the local municipalities, and particularly the planning agency of municipalities and the counties, to provide progress reports every year, a yearly update on progress for general plan policies, and in particular, progress for the housing element. This report is done and then adopted by City Council and then sent up to the Office of Planning and Research, OPR, as well as the Department of Housing and Community Development, otherwise known as HCD. So let me jump to that page on the report here. So, and primarily the report on the housing element has a focus of twofold. One of how is the city progressing and relative to its overall housing RHNA requirements, and we are now right now in the fifth RHNA cycle from 2014 to 2022. So we have 2 more years within the cycle. We've done pretty well on our, we've certainly made our housing target in terms of market units. We're a little bit behind in terms of low and moderate income, and fairly well behind in terms of very low income, a very challenging category to meet. The other part of the housing, this report is to also present to the HCD report on the housing element policies and programs, what action programs have been met, how they've been met, and so on. So to give you a quick overview, basically a lot of the report on the general plan is in a somewhat narrative format. It's an update to last year's report, and where really have just identified some recent changes or things that have occurred relative to land use, how we continue to implement the community character element through design review, heritage preservation. And in particular, I did do an update to this report yesterday in response to some additional input from the Public Works Director on issues such as related to the circulation element, related to the Measure B funding project, and some of the major regional projects, as well as certain Richmond Bridge improvements. Study that's now underway by the Transportation Authority of Marin on the North US 101 to eastbound 580 connector project. And that's a project seen as important to helping to alleviate traffic on Sir Francis Drake, particularly at the Highway 101 interchange. And ongoing improvements to Sir Francis Drake Boulevard for pedestrians and bicyclists, as well as other regional efforts. So it's a quick summary of some of the things that have occurred over last year, with some eyes towards what's coming up in this year moving forward. Discussion on the Larkspur Library Community Facility parcel. That continues, the city continues to engage with the Commons Foundation, which is actively raising funds with anticipation of building a 5,000 square foot first phase building based on an estimated budget of $5 million. So that's the status of that project right now. We've done a lot of work on flood hazard, and particularly on fire hazard updates, and those are actually highlighted some in the housing element report, but in the community and here in the community and safety element. In 2019, we adopted additional building code, and in fact, it was finally adopted in 2020. So we began to update the code and adopted this in 2020, which increased defensible space requirements, identified fire-prone trees for consistency with the fire department, and more stringent requirements to encourage undergrounding of utilities. The Public Works Director also provided more detail on bicycle and pedestrian trails and paths improvements throughout the city that are occurring right now. And in particular, as you can see, there's a lot of ADA improvements that have occurred on crosswalks, as well as the safety improvements at the Magnolia and Madrone Avenue intersection. So again, things that have occurred. In terms of the housing element, I'm going to jump down to the housing element worksheet to basically identify progress, to show you the progress. Over the last, we are now in year 7. We've gone through year 7. We're now getting in year 8 of this, of our housing element. And in this last year, we had only one non-deed restricted ADU. We did not have any new dwelling units, new multifamily units. We've had a lot of interest in ADUs and JADUs, and particularly through the last year, but not the significant kind of development we would like to see. We continue to be engaged with property owners, and we have in fact set up a new set up our website to provide more information and easier access to documents and a checklist to help assist property owners in applying for ADUs. Additionally, the county has developed an interactive checklist that we reference, which provides a lot of resources for property owners in terms of design, financing, getting tenants, things like that. So it's a little more not focused entirely on regulations, local regulations and building codes as much as the bigger picture for any property owner. So there's a lot of steps we're taking to try to encourage more ADU development, but we haven't seen it come to fruition yet. Some of that may be because of the pandemic has depressed significant remodels to some degree this year. But again, we are getting a lot of interest, and I think there's a lot of awareness in the community about what the new ADU regulations have to offer. But we may want to look more towards, and we will be coming back to you with some refinements to the ordinance. And at that time, look at some options or thoughts on how we may, what we're seeing as obstacles or challenges, and what may be some further measures to try to encourage more ADU development, because it is a good source of housing, particularly affordable housing. And then again, just this is the implementation report for the housing element. And this is very structured to follow the regulations for compliance with housing element law. So it goes through every program for under the housing element and provides a detailed update to each program. Our intention will be to set up a similar table for the general plan once it's adopted. We'll then itemize and provide some priorities to each of the programs. Some of the programs are more ongoing, and others will be more of creating an ordinance, things that we can sort of check the box on having done. So with that, this is again, it's really a report to kind of summarize city's actions over last year in terms of implementing the general plan and the housing element. I'll be actually filling out, while you've seen a little graphic there about our housing development, I actually have to fill out a much more detailed spreadsheet itemizing all planning approvals that exist but have not been built, all applications that have been submitted but not issued, all issued applications that have not been completed, and all completed and built applications that are not now occupied. So they want to kind of see the whole pipeline from planning through occupancy. What is reflected here is simply every permit that's issued, because ultimately when it comes to meeting your RENA requirements, it's the permits that are issued that are the important test for the state. So we have put this on the agenda for City Council to review and hopefully send it forward to for us to send forward to housing and OPR. Subsequently, it's required by April 1st of every year. And it's valuable to get a leg up on it, as we're seeing we're clearly not quite meeting our goals. And while that is in the past has not been a significant, necessarily a detriment or a penalty to the city, there is, under new state housing law, there are scenarios where whatever is not completed in terms of your RENA numbers, those might get applied to your next RENA, depending on what efforts are made to address shortfalls. Our major shortfall, again, is in the area of very low income housing. I'm going to just scroll back to that, kind of focus on this. We were required through the methodology that ABAG and the state came up with to create 40 units out of a total of 132 housing units, 40 units of very low income, which is a disproportionate and challenging number. And at this point, we can reasonably say we've created 33 within the next 2 years with ADU development. If it increases any good level of a pace, we might get this down to, maybe the high 20s or 25, but we may end up with about 25 of those units carrying over and a few moderate units carrying over as well. And some of that depends on any development that occurs, but it does appear most of our significant projects that would contribute to to our current RENA would likely not be constructed within the next 2-year cycle. So we may be relying on what efforts we can do to better encourage and identify projects as being entitled to development over the next 2 years to try to meet numbers and avoid a further carryover. I'm having those discussions with staff from HCD at this time right now. The Ross Valley Sanitary District is a project that would have largely completed our low and moderate income requirements. And again, we're already in excess on our above moderate or market rate. So we're not in a position that we need to develop market rate. We're in a position we need to develop very low income housing. And then the further challenge with that is as we get into the next cycle, we'll be faced with a similar proportion of, a very high overall number of around 1,000 units, about a third of those being market rate, and about 2/3 of those being affordable units, with, again, a pretty high proportion, about 300 very low units in that number. So how that gets achieved is difficult to say. We'll be working on that. One thing I can let the commission know is we are right now in talks with the state of California, Department of General Services, and HCD, the department that oversees housing. They're following an executive order that has identified, Gavin Newsom has identified the need to identify surplus lands for housing. And there are several sites throughout the state that these departments have identified for surplus lands that would be suitable for housing. And they've identified a 5-acre portion of San Quentin as a site that would be suitable for an affordable housing project. So they're in the process of issuing an RFP for housing development, and it is the site that's directly adjacent to our border at Drake's Cove. And the city has been in contact with these parties. They're very receptive, and they recognize that it is within the city's sphere of influence, which has generated discussion on the development potentially contributing to our RENA housing and our credits. Exactly how that is done and how that transpires is still yet to be determined, but there may be avenues through that type of development and other public-private partnerships to really encourage housing projects that can be identified with greater proportion of affordable categories over the next several years. And one other thing about the state project is, at this point, the state has indicated they will likely, just in order to accelerate the potential development, they will manage and entitle the project and then turn it over to HCD and the local jurisdiction to issue permits based on those entitlements. So again, we're working on all the machinations that kind of would occur under that scenario. This is actually a new role, a new process for the state. While the state has developed many, state-run facilities, this is new for the state to facilitate basically housing development and have that overseen by the Department of Housing and Community Development in this fashion. So with that, sorry, I know Natasha jumped in here. So I could field any questions. All we really need, if the commission is comfortable, is to motion to accept the annual progress report for the general plan and housing element, and recommend that the city council have staff send it to OPR and HCD.
Neil, I have
And
a,
one thing to put here is that it is state law that the planning agency reviews this. So you guys are the planning agency for the city.
that's an honor. I did have one, I did have a couple questions. One is that you referenced the safety improvements at the corner of Magnolia and the drone. When in the revised version that's on the web now, that sort of got lost. It's no longer there. So I don't know if you want to, claim the bragging rights to that.
Let me check on that. I may be time tends to blend together for me.
Yeah.
But I thought that was done during this last year, but it may have been earlier. But I'll check.
And then the other thing is that you spoke about there's some procedures within the planning department to guide applicants to or nudge applicants in some form toward ADUs or JADUs, and making sure they're informed of the benefits of doing that. But what I found myself wondering is even in applications where the applicant doesn't really intend in the immediate term to implement an ADU or JDU, I was wondering if it would be useful for you to nudge them in the direction of having designs that would at least accommodate an ADU or JDU with a certain amount of ease in the future. So should the circumstances change, should the project change ownership, because that would then facilitate down the road the acquisition of these ADUs and JDUs. So these would be circumstances where the applicant has no immediate intention of actually implementing a full ADU and having someone come in there and rent that property or rent that portion of the property. So I found myself wondering if that is worth mentioning.
Well, I guess the question I have is, is your suggestion that that the applicant is sort of like building an ADU but not necessarily renting it,
or building the property out in such a way that that a portion of the property could easily be transformed into an ADU without major structural changes to the property?
Well, I think that's, I guess the question is, what would be the incentive to, how would we structure an incentive to?
Yeah, that's a little bit delicate, because as you know, in meetings, observing me in meetings, where we are looking at maybe an application where we might be a little bit on the fence. It sometimes I will ask, well, this portion of the home, it looks like it's got this, this room has the necessary square footage to be an ADU. Would it, I ask, would the design accommodate an ADU with a fairly simple set of transformations without any structural transformation? And that to me would be sort of a positive in terms of the application.
I guess one way of looking at what we are doing is we're letting people know, it's becomes just one of those messaging things is, by the way, if you design this, if you design this room a little larger, it might accommodate a, not just a closet, but it could accommodate potentially a future, kitchenette or a
Right.
doorway or something. So, it comes down to these cost benefit analyses that people do when they're, designing floor plans and rooms. But, certainly in a lot of cases, people are, if they're not interested in doing an ADU, they're sort of interested in, as you say, having that option or that potential. I think most of the people, like right now, we've been having discussions with more than one person who are interested in doing a JADU with the intent that they want to make sure that they're keeping the option to put in an ADU.
Right.
Because we've had some discussions with people who are looking at, there are some things, there are some instances where it's almost more favorable to do an ADU than a JADU. And so we do see there are people who are kind of aware of the various nuances, and they're, if not wanting to build both, wanting to make sure they can do one or the other, in time. But I do think when we come back and look at the ADU ordinance, we may want to look at what can we provide a little more incentive from a floor area standpoint to incentivize an ADU development. And it may be such that if you create an ADU, the entire ADU is exempt from floor area, regardless of whether it's part of the, regardless of whether it exceeds the floor area or not. There are some ways of maybe massaging that where we kind of create a little more incentive.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. Yeah. Okay. Thank. And then the last thing I'm going to point out this evening or ask about is in your set of charts, this thing. There's a reference of a state audit of inspection programs that have been imposed on Novato and San Rafael. And then you make the comment that if that were mandated in Larkspur, we could, that could be trouble. Is that, I'm just imagining that possibility is very remote.
Well, I kept that in there. Yeah, it seems remote. It was an issue a few years back, and the irony was the state audited programs that were doing resale reports, and basically said, if you do this process, you need to be a lot more informative. It needs to have greater oversight, greater tracking. So it was loading a whole lot of mandates, sort of suggesting a lot of mandates about how that resale report process should go. With the fact that some cities just don't do it. So here in Larkspur, we do it for the purpose of trying to encourage health and safety without trying to be very onerous to the property owner and without trying to create a large process at our end. So I've kind of included that as that's a carryover statement from a few years ago to really just identify that we have a resale program that provides the benefit of informing the buyer and provides the benefit of doing some basic safety oversight for resales without generating a lot of enforcement and saying you can't, because some cities will say, well, you can't sell a property until you do X, Y, and Z. Our approach is, this is just an informational report, but here are things we found that are substandard and ought to be fixed, or here is a potential violation. And the only thing that actually does occur that's pretty automatic is the fire department now does a review for vegetation management as part of the resale, and they will issue a report which doesn't hold up the resale at all. It's fine, but they then will identify if there is vegetation management that has to be done and will then enforce that. So there are some steps that do become kind of enforcement measures, but from a planning and building code, again, we don't hold up sale, but we may do enforcement if it's a serious health and safety issue or planning issue, like you've been adding on a second story or something like that without permits. But it was that's just some language that really was a carryover.
Okay, all right.
Kind of for the record.
Okay, thanks.
Neil, I think, for ADUs to work, the problem is the cost of construction in our town is really high. And for people to build an ADU and to expect to, if they rent it, to get their money back, it's a pretty long-term deal. And it involves, upgrading plumbing, you have fire suppression, all these things. And I think until somebody starts modularizing this in a way that you can actually go out and say, that one looks good. And, it's going to be, certain people are going to do it, but it's going to be hard to get people to spend the money. And that's what I'm finding with people that talk to me, and you tell them how much it costs a square foot to build, and they lose interest. And
well, I think one of the things we're finding is it seems from our discussion, and again, a lot of this is anecdotal because we're all fielding, between the three of us, we're fielding calls at various intervals. But it does seem like some of the major obstacle now, it's no longer zoning to a great degree, because really a lot of this is fairly by right. You could convert a garage, you could convert interior space, you can add on up to 800 square feet, and just with a building permit, regardless of your floor area or just about anything. So from a zoning point of view, there's very few obstacles, and we don't charge a fee for the initial review. So getting the foot in the door and getting it started, and we only do it through a building permit unless for some reason you're doing the kind of project that would trigger a higher level review. But it seems like a lot of interest, because of what you just said, is the cost of construction. A lot of interest is in conversion, pretty simple, like let's modify a basement or convert a garage. But what we're finding is just the construction cost, like people would like to just put a sink and a stove in their garage and call that a dwelling unit. And we kind of go, no, it has to be habitable. You've got to seal off the door. You've got to put in a window. Hey, who is that?
Actually,
All right, my
actually,
daughter really wants to say hi. Come on, Hannah, say hi.
Is that your second, the tenant in your second unit?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Okay, go on, say hi now.
Hi.
Hi there.
That's Hannah. Sorry's my youngest. Oh, you want to say hi too? This is my eldest, Pippa. Sorry, I was hiding in the bedroom. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Nighttime. Let's go.
Okay, good night.
All right, well, we'll get you going. But yeah, it seems like even just the basic costs of upgrading some plumbing, doing some ventilation, putting in windows are just giving people a pause.
Yeah.
That, you can't just take a 6-foot high ceiling, storage room in your
Right.
basement and make that into a second unit.
Yeah.
That's why I was thinking that in the context of applications where people are engaging in fairly large, fairly substantive transformation projects anyway, that if they sort of tack on this accommodation of an ADU or JADU to the project, that that would decrease the incremental cost would be less than starting something de novo.
Yeah, it's kind of like pre-fitting for solar when you build a house or something. You just kind of build it into it, and then
Yeah.
if you decide to put in the solar later, it's a lot easier to do so.
I've got experience with that. Yes.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that has to change to some degree is that in my experience, there is neighbor opposition to people doing these things. And I've had people that say, gosh, my neighbors really are upset about this. I'm just not going to do it. And,
Yeah, but we've confronted that before, where we've had neighbors come in with speculation about the behavior of whoever is going to be occupying a JDU, and we've sort of we've tended to bat that down. In fact, the one that generated quite a bit of opposition based on speculation about parking issues and noise and bonfires or what have you. In fact, that JDU has been in place now, I think, for 3 years, and none of those problems have actually surfaced.
Right. Well, one thing I might suggest on this is twofold. One is on Friday, the 26th in the morning. It's tentatively scheduled. I'm going to be having a strategic plan meeting with the city council. That's going to be really a discussion about our housing issues, kind of where we're going, where this whole transition of updating the general plan right now, trying then getting our housing element going, and given the RENA. And I think part of that's going to be, really educating some of the council members on these topics, things that they're, don't necessarily have a lot of experience in, as well as discussing what the options are for the city. And I do think we're going to have to, create some kind of, I don't want to say housing committee, but maybe it's going to be a steering committee or something, preferably work within a small group, but sort of work on the various strategies. And one thing I think that would be really helpful to us on this topic is if a couple of the commissioners wanted to review, our ADU webpage and our forms, and look at the adumarin.org site. And I can also send you the guidebook that the state finally provided a guidance document last, I think, in October, almost a year after all this was adopted. So even though we had to adopt an ordinance, the guidebook, the guidance came later, and it's actually pretty helpful. It's a little informative. I think there's some things we can look at and maybe change, but it may help to have some feedback from your eyes if maybe two of you are willing to kind of, do some homework and work, provide us some feedback, and then we could work on updating the ordinance and bringing that back to the commission with some preliminary guidance or suggestions. So I'm going to throw that out there.
Let's do it all talk at once.
It's a good idea, actually.
And I think in the future, as we have this strategic meeting, part of that is going to be how do we as a community begin to tackle some of these issues and begin preparing for the housing element update? Because typically you have some kind of housing working group or a housing advisory committee or something like that. I know we like to be careful not to, we don't really have the resources and the funding to be manning a really large process. We don't really need to reinvent the wheel. I think there's a lot that's Marin is, tackling these issues in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of lessons learned. It's not easy, but it's really just trying to find what's going to work for the city, and then begin applying it to specific sites and areas too. I mean, this is ADU, but also looking at, what areas, what sites, looking at our existing opportunity sites and how they might be, how we might look at them with a little more of an eye towards, higher housing. I don't think that necessarily means higher density. It might mean, what kind of policies and programs can we put forward to really encourage the housing, as opposed to a lot of policies and such that might not, might be obstructing it right now. So that's again, just kind of putting the seeds, the thoughts in your head. And as I said, we'll be having the strategic meeting. I will give you a heads up on it. So those of you who are interested can watch, because I think a lot of the focus is going to be on, housing and development and traffic issues. So it's going to be related to planning.
Yeah, it would be good if we could at least view what's going on.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions on this?
Just one quick question, not to belabor this, but when does the next cycle start? Is that 2022?
2023 is the year of the next cycle, 2023 to 2031. It's an 8-year cycle. If you're compliant, if we're not compliant, if for some reason we're not able to create a housing element that meets all the state guidelines and technical requirements, it's usually a 4-year window. They have you come back and do an update in 4 years, which is sort of half dozen or the other, but ideally it's nice to be able to, achieve what you want to do within one process.
And that's when, in theory, we need to come up with 1,000 housing units.
Well, yes. Yeah. You need to come up with 1,000 housing units over that 8-year cycle.
80.
And the interesting part is there has to be, what HCD did in this last cycle is about halfway through it, when the housing crisis was really hitting its peak and the legislature was passing the housing packages, basically a series of bills that really overhauled and increased the mandates and increased funding as well. When they did that, HCD read into the legislation that the cities needed to demonstrate process. They passed SB 35, and I've talked about this briefly. What it basically said was, if you're not on track, then you're getting a penalty. You'll need to start adopting. We'll start imposing sort of like by right development standards on you. So if you're on track, you're going to get penalized. And the awkward thing about that is that in a city, in a community like Larkspur, housing, big housing production doesn't happen on a regular schedule. One year, you might get a big project, you get a Rose Lane, you get a Ross Valley Sanitary District. It's not going to be, otherwise we're pretty built out. So what you're achieving is going to be mostly infill of ADUs. There's very little new housing a year. And so it's awkward because you can begin building the incentives and the regulations to really create the opportunities for the development, but that doesn't mean it's all going to happen in time, and it doesn't mean it's all going to happen on schedule. We could end up with, be short for the first 4 years and then but be planning for some significant development, but those permits don't get issued till the latter part of the cycle, and they're already penalizing you because you haven't been making your housing numbers. I could talk about HCD. I mean, I think their intent is very good, is good. There is a housing crisis, and I think we all understand that, and it's a challenge. The one size fit all and technical applications are not always practical or reasonable, and not always give you the best result. But I think part of what we want to try to do is get ahead of that and make sure we're developing the housing that really works for Larkspur. So.
Okay. Can I have somebody move to approve the minutes from January 26th?
Do we need a motion on?
Yeah, if you
Oh,
can.
do we?
Yeah, if you can do a motion to do that, I said it here.
Sure. I move to recommend that the city council accept the annual progress report on the Larkspur General Plan and Housing Element for the calendar year 2019.
Actually, 2020, excuse me.
It is 2020 because it's okay.
It does say 29.
I did not change
It
that.
says 2018, so I thought it was
Right.
done in 2020, reflecting 2019. Okay, scratch that. I'm going to start over. I move to recommend that the city council accept the annual progress report on the Larkspur General Plan and Housing Element for the calendar year 2020 to send to the State Office of Planning and Research and the State Department of Housing and Community Development.
Second it.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? And one person absent.
So for the record, Laura Tauber is absent.
Tauber. Now, can we approve the minutes of January 26th? Would somebody like to move that?
I move that we approve the minutes of January 6, 26.
Do we have a second?
I can second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Are there any planning commissioners' reports? I don't see any.
Okay, just for the just since kind of like to let you know, we will be having a meeting on the 23rd. We do have a couple items planned to be scheduled on that date.
We can just use the old Zoom one that we got.
Well, we'll have to send out a new one. I apologize for that mix-up. Kristen was preparing the agenda, but she was also preparing her notices and Outlook, so she had the 26th on her mind, is my guess.
Would somebody like to move to end the meeting?
I move to adjourn.
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, everybody.